Now, to get the discussion going, I'd now like to welcome our esteemed panellists and invite them to the stage. Here today to share their views on the key themes in the Mapping Social Cohesion report, we have Assistant Commissioner of Victoria Police, Andrew Crisp. Lawyer and social justice advocate, Azmeena Hussain. The CEO of the Australian Industry Group, Willox. And the General Manager of Stakeholder Relations at AMES, Baxter. Thank you all for joining us today. Now, being a journalist, and Professor Andrew Markus, the report's author, he's also part of the panel. Thank you all for joining us today. Now, being a journalist, I naturally have a few questions that I'd like to ask of you, but ladies and gentlemen, we'll also have some time at the end for some questions. So throughout the discussion, and if anyone has a question they would like to ask of our panellists, I ask that you please hold on to it, and I'll call for the questions at the end, at which point we'll bring a microphone to you. So, as we've just heard, Australia is by and large a highly cohesive nation, and we've also heard that there are a number of issues that potentially point to underlying problems. Now, drawing on your personal and professional experience, how do you view Australia's level of social cohesion? And perhaps we'll begin with you right at the end, Professor Andrew Markus.
Well, I think I've sort of had my penny's worth on that one. Really just then to, I guess, emphasise that Australia is very unusual. There's probably only 2 countries in the world, in the developed world but certainly, that welcome immigration, and that's Australia and Canada. And the fact that we've had such wide endorsement of diversity across this survey, I think is very significant. For example, amongst the 3rd generation Australians, it's hard to find anybody who'll say that I don't like meeting people from other cultures. You know, we're looking at less than 10% with many of these sorts of issues. So I emphasise it's an open society, and it's a society that welcomes immigration. At the same time, I don't want to romanticise that. I don't want to suggest to you that it's an easy path for people who come here as immigrants. It is hard. There's no question about that. It's always been hard, and it is hard. I think most people, if they had their choice, would stay in their own countries and see their own countries prosper. But nonetheless, the point that if people come to Australia, and even though the 1st generation might find it difficult, certainly in the past they've been able to be confident that their children are getting opportunities. And it's vital that certainly that element continue. And that's why I think education is so significant in this process.
Now, on immigration, we've seen a change in attitudes toward immigration. In 2004, 58% of people agree that Australia's immigration intake is about right or too low. And this is possibly the highest level of support for immigration in the Western world. Adam Baxter, what do you think has influenced this?
Good question. I think that there's been a greater recognition in the community that we have skills shortages, that we have an ageing population, and that we certainly have, particularly in Victoria, as we saw in the papers this week, fairly significant declining birth rates. I think also the fact that we've had 8 million migrants since 1945, and if you take into account the 2nd and 3rd generation, it's pretty hard to disagree that migration has been bad for the country if you happen to fall into that category. I think those are the things that tend to drive people's perception of migration.
And how important are settlement services and support for new migrants when they arrive?
How important?
How important?
Ridiculously important. I think it's about providing the right support. So it's not about a hand up, but it's not about a hand out, but about a hand up. It's about making sure that they have some ability to engage through language, through building local experience in terms of the job market. It's about providing training and skills recognition. And it's about some better sense of cultural and legal orientation. I think that's what's been missing for a long time, and I know that Victoria Police and AMES, for example, have been working quite closely about how do you engage local communities in understanding better social legal obligation.
And perhaps you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, definitely, it's a really good point, and it's something that we've been working very hard at, because as you would appreciate, a lot of people are coming from a lot of countries where there's basically distrust of policing and the broader criminal justice system. So again, that's an opportunity for us to start building those trusting relationships at the same time, explaining in fact how we go about our work. So it's a critical element in terms of support services.
Azmeena, there's a high level of support for multiculturalism. What do you think multiculturalism means to Australia?
I think the definition of multiculturalism comes down to when we all have an equal sense of belonging in the society. And I think with multiculturalism we've really reached our success when you can have someone that's come from a different country come to Australia and they feel Australian and they feel that sense of belonging. I think in saying that Australia to some extent has a bit of a long way still to go in embracing multiculturalism. I mean, if you look at the example in the UK, for example, someone in my auntie in the UK, if she's walking down the street and someone says to her, well, where are you from? She'd respond with Bristol or East Hampton. She automatically identifies herself as British and from the UK. But in the same sense, if here in Australia someone wants to approach me and say, oh, where are you from? I automatically assume that they're talking about my cultural background. So I think there's a bit of work that needs to be done in creating that increased sense of belonging.
And in Willox, amongst third-generation Australians, there's a high level of agreement that immigrants should change their behaviour to be more like Australians. What does that say about how accepting we are of diversity?
Well, the reality is that we're a migrant nation. We, as the report again emphasises, we aren't replacing ourselves naturally, so we need migrants, and we need what we are now seeing as a situation where we have a history, particularly post-war, of being a migrant nation and bringing diversity to Australia, but that diversity is now increasing as time has gone on, and we are now seeing people from more parts of the world coming to Australia, and this creates a situation where there are both upsides and downsides. There are challenges for the community as a whole. There are challenges for those who come here and those who are already here to be accepting and understanding both ways. And this is particularly the case as well. We heard from Bruce this morning talking about the changing economy, and that is certainly going to put another layer of challenge out there for us and challenge that notion of acceptance as people look for work. They largely come here, as Adam said, looking for economic stability and economic growth, and we are going to be challenged to find and create that growth as our economy is going through a transformation. So we have to find the right skills and the right people, and largely I think my takeout from Andrew's report was that our community attitudes towards immigration are inordinately and disproportionately driven by response around asylum seeker policy. And that seems to be what drives community attitude. So the sense that Andrew was talking about was that the government, however you may view this, the government has this under control, will hopefully in turn lead to, over time, even more agreement around immigration policy going forward. It only makes up a tiny proportion of our overall immigration intake, and the large part of our immigration intake is based around skills, and it's finding people with the right skills from around the world to come here to contribute to Australia. That's the challenge.
Can I just go back
absolutely.
to... Sorry, is it all right with me to ask a question?
Go for it.
Because you start off with about the issue around third-generation Australians, and I sort of picked up on Andrew's presentation where you mentioned, I believe, that most were from an Anglo-Celtic background and therefore would determine some of their attitude, and naturally you would think that we might see a change when there's that shift from the Anglo-Celtic background. In terms of people, I suppose, being more accepting of what the so-called Australian values are.
Yes. And sorry, just on that as well. When we say people come to Australia and they should, be more Australian, I get a bit confused by that concept because what is it to be Australian, or what is it to be un-Australian? If I use my mum as an example, she came to this country, she had children, she wanted to give us a safe and secure upbringing, she wanted to give us a good education. Is that not Australian? The day she got her citizenship, is she not then Australian? So I don't think there's an answer to should someone be more Australian when they come to this country.
Professor Markus, perhaps you'd like to clarify about how...
It's an interesting sort of concept to be more like Australian, because as you rightly say, what is Australian? I think what that's being said there, it's a statement about comfort, and it's a statement about moving towards the norm rather than moving away from the norm, even though that there's no definition of it. And of course, what it is to be an Australian, it's very different to what it is to be in Australia in the year 2014 than what was in 1950. So they're both moving targets, but I think what is being said there, and I think it is consistent across the survey, is that there shouldn't be cultural separateness, there should be dialogue, and dialogue should be effective and seen to be dialogue, and there should be an aspiration, having come to Australia, and this is a challenge for some groups, but there is, I think, a strong aspiration, having come to Australia, to adjust. And adjust is ambiguous.
Can I add to that as well? One of the issues I was out at a university recently talking to a group of African Australians, and they are having a significant struggle with identifying and how do they explain themselves. Do they call themselves African Australians? And it's a similar thing that we've seen in the Chinese community now into the third and fourth generations, where they call themselves ABCs. I think it's less a question about diversity and more a question about identity. That to me is what I see communities are struggling with. How do they identify rather than whether it's an acceptance of diversity or multiculturalism?
And so what are some of the ways that you think that communities can deal with that, with identity? Because that's something I've personally struggled with. How do I identify as Australian, African Australian?
I don't have the answer. I wish I did. But I do know, for example, in our family, we're approaching or have just approached the third generation of our arrival in this country. And my background is my parents were Anglo-Burmese and Anglo-Indian. And when they arrived in Australia, part of their family didn't speak English, weren't allowed off the boat, and were sent to South Africa and basically have disappeared. And I've watched my family struggle with that issue of identity. My father has an Order of Australia. He believes he is firmly believes he's Australian, but on a regular basis we would still be identified as something other than Australian. When I'm asked where am I from, I say I'm from Western Australia, and people go, no, but where is your family from? So I don't think there's an answer to it, but I think it's something that different communities have to arrive at their own response and then get behind that response. I think the African Australian community particularly is struggling with that at the moment.
Azmeena Hussain, did you want to add to that?
Just more on a practical sense, I just think it's really important that we do engage in community engagement with people of different backgrounds or of different religious backgrounds. If you look at the Muslim community at the moment, when people say to me, oh, here's Azmeena, here's trouble, I don't know whether they're talking about my religion or just me as Azmeena. But research has shown that when individuals from different backgrounds do meet people from different backgrounds or different religious backgrounds, that has a far greater influence on that person's perception as opposed to the media or any political fear that's put out there.
That's where I think workplaces are crucial in this discussion, because that is where you will have different communities coming together in workplaces and exposure to different cultures, different backgrounds, different ways of thinking. And that's why work employers and workplaces aren't trainers, but they are the place where people come together. And that's where some employers struggle about, well, how do we help integrate this workforce to make it a cohesive workforce, and then that will then spread out to be a cohesive community.
And if I could just add to that, and that's some of the positives that I'm seeing with the events that I'm going to and the communities I'm interacting with, where some of the more established communities are actually taking a lead role in trying to bring together other communities and support them. Again, talking about the Australian African. It's interesting, you say African Australian, I say Australian African, so that's an issue in itself. What do you put first? Is it the Australian or is it the African? Who do you actually identify with? But there's a major music event coming up at the end of the year, a bit of a plug, December the 20th, Fed Square. I'm sure it'll be a great event. But it's bringing together a steering committee of representatives of 13 different African countries, and I'm seeing more and more of that happening. We know that broadly, the Jewish community is working with the Muslim community in relation to a whole range of different issues at the moment. So I'm seeing a lot more of that, which I think is really positive, because again, I don't think there's any right or wrong answer in terms of being Australian, but it's about actually how we all work together.
So on the issue of discrimination, the reported experience of discrimination on the basis of race, ethnic origin or religion has remained close to the highest level in the Scanlon surveys. What conclusion can we draw from this? Are we a racist nation? Professor Markus.
Yes, I don't think you can draw that we're a racist nation. There are elements within the community, as there are in all societies, who do not accept diversity and who do not accept people from other cultures and other backgrounds. That's a constant. It's not something that distinguishes Australia. Rather, I think what distinguishes Australia is facing these challenges and attempting to move forward, and it's the level of engagement, I think, that characterises Australia rather than the negative.
Ines Willox, you talked about the workplace and how that can play a role in terms of discrimination. How does that fit in?
I think it's a challenge. I have to be really honest here. I hear some horrible stories about what goes on in workplaces, and it works both ways. Employers certainly aren't racist. Businesses aren't racist. I would say I'd agree with Andrew. There's no way you could characterise Australia as racist. It has been welcoming. It's had some rocky patches, for sure. And there's always going to be incidents, and there's always going to be people who are unfortunately bigoted and closed mind. But on the whole, we're at a point now where we are perhaps going to be tested. We're going to be tested because our economy is going through significant change. You'll have seen we have youth unemployment at around 18%. We have some pockets of unemployment which are up around 30%. That is going to test our cohesion, and that will test our fabric. Now, employers will employ when they can employ. But if there isn't the work there's not much they can do. The other point that Bruce touched on very early is that with our economy changing shape, and perhaps one of the big traditional soaker upper, if I can use that as a word, of labour, the manufacturing sector is going through enormous change. You're seeing increased automation. You're seeing different work practices being engaged in that sector, where probably the number of people who will be employed will reduce over time. So that will put pressure on different parts of our society. So it's not a matter of racism, it's a matter of economic capacity that I see, and people's sort of willingness to be open to new ideas and new customs and new ways of looking at life.
And negative sentiment towards Muslims was 5 times higher than towards Christians or Buddhists. Andrew Crisp, how can we as a community help foster greater acceptance?
Yeah, this is probably one of the most disturbing aspects of the report that I read, and it is a concern. So what do we do about it? Well, many people in the room here, we hold leadership roles, so it's about the language that we use. It's about how we conduct ourselves. I suppose the elephant in the room is the media, and the media plays a very strong role in terms of how people perceive those of other backgrounds. And again, it was interesting reading this, because I think that, I asked the question myself, well, how many of those people have actually interacted with people from various Muslim communities? I'm sure there's probably not a lot of them. So therefore, how are they influenced? And it's through the language of our leaders, and it's through the media. So it's about getting those positive messages out, and I know that's a critical challenge for all of us.
It's also education. Schools have an enormous role to play here. I mean, schools themselves are becoming melting pots, but there's a role here, I think, for schools to move beyond sort of being quite inward-looking towards being outward-looking, about trying to teach the school population about different cultures, different religions, different ways of life, because what do they say? Give me a child of 7 and I'll give you the adult. And that's really important. It's about formulating views and getting young people to understand that there are different cultures and different ways of life. And I think that's going to be crucial going forward.
And how do you think the current political climate is affecting all of this? Adam Baxter?
How is the current political climate? I don't think the politics is really impacting. I think it's about the education. I agree with my colleagues up here that it is about education. It's about understanding and awareness. I was listening to Raphael Epstein driving home on Monday night, and he was talking about the Virgin Mary Mosque in the western suburbs, and he had a plethora of phone calls and texts come in because people were saying he was wrong. What was the Virgin Mary doing in the Muslim community? What was that all about? And Raf is a Jewish born, and it was quite interesting the way he tried to engage with those callers who were pretty racist about this issue. And I think it does come back to education. One of the things we find, and in any given year we would have 45,000 new arrivals in our programs. It's about that education, it's about discussion. We find a number of people from certain communities or from certain countries who've never engaged with a Muslim, even through our programs. And it's watching that discourse happening through the classrooms that I think is really, really important. If we're going to have a curriculum debate in this country, it's probably about these types of issues as opposed to whether we're talking about Indigenous issues and that sort of thing. It's about getting a broader scale of understanding through the community.
The last couple of years I've been basically looking after the delivery of policing services in the northern and western suburbs, where schools actually become a community hub. So then it's not just about the children, it's about the parents as well, because that's again when we need to educate.
I think the reality is with the Muslim community, we've taken a big step back and things are almost where they were at after September 11. As a Muslim and someone from the community, I think there's a sense that the Muslim community has been dehumanised. I think there's a couple of things we need to look back and reflect on. One of that being the political leadership in this country and the media commentary, which to some extent has been quite hysterical. The impact it's had on the Muslim community is massive. I think with a lot of what is said in the community hasn't come from the Muslim community directly. I think there needs to be more done to have the Muslim community represented in the media and actually hear from the people that experience discrimination. You'll often find on TV, or you'll have politicians or a panel of people speaking about racism or discrimination, but it's just absurd. It's almost the same as having a panel of men speaking about women's issues and feminism. You need to hear from the communities themselves and the ones that are facing the discrimination.
Thanks for that. And at this stage, I think I might open up the floor to a couple of questions. And there's a microphone floating around. Yeah, the gentleman just over here to the right.
Hi, I'm Eddie Miklo from the Ethnic Communities Council of Victoria's Chair. Look, one of the things that I haven't read the report properly, which probably doesn't pick up, is the fact that the opposition to multiculturalism has become far more aggressive. And I think the expression, the media has played quite a role in that. And I'm somebody from a non-English speaking background has difficulty identifying with the term Team Australia. And that, to me, that alienates, it sets up barriers. And Adam, I disagree with the political leadership of this country has let us down quite a lot, I think. And I think we have to educate, and issues like 18C, the rise of Hansonism, all those sort of things come along and challenge us. Look, we have a good society, but I think we need to do much better. And my last quick point is the third generation attitudes of established migrant groups towards the new and emerging communities is a challenge that we are aware of and we're trying to grapple with as an Ethnic Communities Council of Victoria.
All right, fantastic. Thank you for that observation. Just to the gentleman in the second row.
Graham Leonard, BMC. Congratulations, Peter and Andrew and your team, on yet another great contribution to our society. My question to the panel is, the surprise to me in the findings this year was the attitude towards diversity, or negative perception of diversity. And I wonder whether any in the panel sees some linkage between the attitude to our Muslim Australians and the emphasis on Australian way of life versus emphasis on diversity.
Can I just make a point? I hear what Eddie's saying. I do have trouble with part of what you're saying. I hear what you're saying totally. The fact is that Australia still takes just under 200,000 migrants a year. And it's a government program. It's something that employers support. I think we shouldn't lose sight of that. And it's a diverse migration program. I think we've got to look at this in stages. You're not going to change community attitudes or suspicions or doubts overnight. This always takes time to seep through. Adam mentioned Raphael's discussion the other night about a mosque. We have to be realistic here. This is new to Australia. The idea that a mosque would be set up in a suburban community. So the suburban community asks, what does that mean? What does that mean for us? What does it mean for the surrounding? I don't think there could perhaps be racism in part of that, but I don't think it's necessarily racist. I think it's the community sort of asking itself, how are we changing? And any society has to ask those questions and go through that sort of growth process as it changes. And to your question about attitudes around discrimination, I think this will change over time from my perspective as we get more migrants from more diverse backgrounds that are moving into our society and are working and are participating in society more broadly and in their own communities. That will change. I don't think we can expect to snap the fingers and see acceptance straight away. I think there's a right within a community and a society to ask questions and to test themselves, but I have complete confidence, given our history, that we will adapt and change. That would be how I'd say it.
Great. And we'll probably have time for just one more question. Yep, just to the lady.
Hi, I'm Karen Marlow, Pro Bono Australia, and I guess this question is for you, Professor Markus. Did you slice the data by either gender or age? And if so, did that have any significant results?
Answer is yes. Gender is not such a significant factor at the macro level. It may well be if we go at sort of small levels of aggregation, but in the national survey it's not significant. Age is significant, particularly, for example, amongst the older section of the community, so people aged 65 and above. You've got more conservatism, more negativity, say, towards Muslim Australians, whereas young people, it's the obverse, so 18 to 24, but even some of the other younger age groups, that's quite a significant factor. And that, I think, is, captures that historical lag. That this is be more like Australia. Well, the Australia for an 18-year-old is very different from what Australia means to a 65-year-old. So it's a process of change, and I think we're all agreed that the challenge is to foster dialogue across communities and to break down barriers and to destroy abstractions and humanise. That's what we're in the business of.
Well, we're now officially out of time, and that means we must bring our panel session to a close. So, ladies and gentlemen, just join me in a round of applause for our panellists today. And
Can I just... Yeah, I know it's me and I can't help myself, but you haven't said all the good news stories about police.
The police.
No. But I just want to finish on a really, really positive note. And I hear what you're saying, Eddie, but I suppose I want to speak personally from what I see and what I do in going to many, many different events, as I know many of you here do. And there's as we've heard, very much a bipartisan approach that we see in Victoria, which is fantastic, which is reflected in the data that we've seen today. There is a really positive story about Victoria Police and, to a lesser extent, about the courts itself. But I want you to all take credit for that, because I see many, many friendly faces there, and you are friends of Victoria Police, but not just friends in sort of the slap on the back type friend, but you're our critical friend. So we've still got work to do. I thank you for your support. We look forward to working with you in the future. Thank you.
thank you.